Hey, welcome back to another episode of Get Your Fill, Financial Independence and Long Life. And today we have the perfect person to talk about both of those things because John K. Ross is with us. And it's actually John K. Ross the fourth, which I really like because I feel like legacy wealth sort of maybe ties into all this. He was raised in Texas, and now he's a partner in one of the most distinguished boutique elder law firms in the world, in the country, in Texas. I didn't get that part.
Well, certainly in the Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana region. How about that?
Perfect. And John has a fantastic podcast called Big Picture. And that's like, right, so let's just start there. First of all, John, thanks for being with us.
Yeah, glad to be here. Absolutely.
So I was just going to jump into like big picture because I feel like I know what it like evokes to me. What does it mean to you when you came up with that name for your podcast?
Well, if you're trying to navigate through, particularly if you're trying to navigate through your retirement years, there's so many different elements that play into this. There's, of course, like from my perspective, you lots of legal issues. Um, you've got your wills and trusts and powers of attorney, but then you also have the interplay with government benefit programs. You have Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, veterans programs. You get all of those coming in. Tax issues is a big deal. And so, I'm also an accountant as well as a lawyer. And so, having to know all the tax stuff. But then you get the financial planning side of everything. You don't want to run out of money.
Yeah.
And so yeah, you get insurance issues. There's just all these different things that all pile in together. And so yeah, my thought is that if you really want to be able to navigate the way through, you've got to make sure that you're not omitting something along the way that comes in and bites you in the rear later on.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're right. Like you get the 50,000-foot view and make sure that you're taking in all those components and thinking about those components so that your retirement plan doesn't have to die really young, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I often I do a lot of speeches, and one of the ones that I talk about is the title of it is it's like the 5 big mistakes, and a lot of that is like you take it from a financial perspective. A lot of times when somebody is rolling into that maybe 65 age range, and they're maybe sitting down with their financial advisor, and they're looking down the road and they're saying, okay, well, what's going to be our withdrawal strategy on our 401k, and how does that tie into our Social Security, and should we do a Roth conversion so we'll have after tax income, and all of these sort of questions, right? And they're also at the same time they're thinking, well, and now I have Medicare, and I pay for a supplement, or maybe I'm a retired federal employee. And so really, other than being able to cover my Medicare supplement, I pretty much don't have to worry about healthcare costs anymore. Oh, yeah. Good luck with that.
Yeah.
Right. And nobody thinks about, oh, well, yeah, what happens if I have a stroke and I can't go back home? Or if I want to go back home, I can't get off the couch without somebody being there. And how much is that going to cost? And if you're not factoring that part in, that's a fast way to broke town
Right.
if you don't care for it. So that's one of those kind of things where, yeah, you really have to have that kind of big picture, looking at all of these little pieces.
Yeah. And it's so easy to think, okay, should I play golf or should I take up tennis? Right. You're not thinking about what if something horrible happens. Of course, who wants to think about that in at any age? But somebody has to be at least making some plans in case something horrible happens.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, nobody. I kind of joke that I get to sit around and talk to people every day about getting old and dying.
Right.
Um, ooh, that's fun. Um, but almost a universal experience. I was trying to finish up with a client, just right now, so I could come in and do this show. And as we're getting done, and they're walking out of the conference room, and they turn to me and they say, God, it just feels so much better. We haven't even done it yet. We just talked about it. We just got the idea of what we're going to put into place, right? We haven't even done it yet, and already you can see the stress and some of the fear that they walked in with fall off their shoulders. And some of these concerns that they had about their own long-term care costs, or that one kid that's not really good with money, or that daughter-in-law that they don't really like, or
Right.
whatever these little pieces of the family dynamic that have been stressing them out. They didn't know if there was a solution, and sure enough, there are.
Of
you
course.
know
If it is somebody, but there are so many aspects of it, right? I mean, just like the things that you brought up, like, how are we going to make this fair for everyone? How are we going to make sure that, there's no incentive for our kids to want to kill us off? How are we going to make sure that, like that everybody, that that you're taken care of, that you're hopefully leaving some kind of a legacy. But the other thing that I was thinking of when you were saying that is, I feel like people should do their will when they're like 18 years old, because the closer you get to being a little bit old, like, you get really superstitious. You're like, oh, I can't do my will because then I'm going to die. Like, if I'm prepared for
that's
death, it's going to come. So I better just like put that off, and then I'll never die.
Yeah, you do actually see that. We will get calls a lot of times from like a hospice, and they'll call and they say, we have a patient, and he's really, really sick, and he would like to get a will done, or something like that. And can you meet with him? And I'm looking at my calendar. I'm like, yeah, I'm booked up this week. Maybe end of next week, first of the week after that, I've got a couple of openings. And they're like, yeah, he's probably going to be dead in 72 hours. And we've had those. I mean, where I've done I've met with a guy on a Thursday evening, executed a will on a Friday morning, and the person is deceased Friday afternoon. I've
That
had
is
it
the
happen.
last minute, right? I mean,
Yeah,
talk
I mean,
about procrastination.
yeah. I mean, when they're dying hours after, we put something in place. And in many cases, I have asked the family, and I'm like, well, now your dad, or your husband, or whoever it is, your mom, now they were diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 9 months ago. Well, yeah.
So then you definitely can't do the will then, because that is just the death sentence.
Well, I'm like, why in the world did we wait until this last minute? And that is one of the things that they'll often say. Is they're like, well, we kind of felt like if we did a will, that we were giving up. That and I'm like, giving up from what? Did you think, well, if we beat the cancer, we're never going to die again, right?
Right.
All of a sudden, we're the Highlander, and you know,
Right.
no, right? I mean, it's a ticking clock for all of us, and so it's kind of funny that people, but you're right, they do get somewhat superstitious. Now, yeah, I mean, the flip side of that, like, you talk about like 18-year-old, I do have people, and they'll say, well, John, okay, you call yourself an elder law attorney. Well, how old do you need to be to see an elder law attorney? And my joke reply is 18. You
Yeah.
can't be any younger than that. You can't
Right.
legally
You can't be, you
contract,
have to be
right?
legal. That's it.
Right. But I will say that generally, if you can say, if you can answer the three questions of, are you married? The answer is no. Okay. Do you have any children? Answer's no. And are you broke? Answer's yes. Okay, well, if you can do
You're
those,
good.
if you can, yeah, you probably don't
Die
need anything.
anytime, no problem.
Yeah, knock yourself out, right? No big deal. But if you say, if you're answering positively to one of those, right? If you have a spouse, if you have a child, if you have any assets to speak of, you need probably something. It doesn't have to be complicated, but you probably need something. But I will say that I have tried for years to get people under, call it 55, to do estate planning, and you're just wasting your breath for the most part. Unless they've had a traumatic experience in their own family where, they had the death of a parent and it was just an absolute nightmare, or they had a parent that got Alzheimer's at, 55 or 60 or, some really
Right.
just tragic kind of situation. And they saw them, bleed through all of their assets. And then yeah, at those cases, yeah, I've got, a 38-year-old in there going, okay,
Do it.
um, yeah, let's do some stuff. I don't know what, but let's do something.
Yeah.
Um, but there is something about that kind of over 55 time frame where a lot of these things do start settling in on the brain, and you start thinking about, retirement. You also have a tendency to start thinking about your own, mortality, and often in that same age range, you're losing parents. If you're 55, you've got a parent that's 80, 85, and so you're losing parents, and so it is becoming very real. And that's where a lot of that time, and that's also a good, it's not too soon, it's not too early, it's not too late. That's a good range in there for most people.
Yeah.
But like you said, I I make my kids sign powers of attorney the day they turn 18. You don't
Why
get to
not?
decide
It's
when
easy,
you
right?
become incapacitated, right? And the first time you have a conversation with a parent because their son went off to XYZ university, was in a car wreck, has a brain injury, and they can't speak to their own health insurance company about their son because that would be a HIPAA violation, because he's over the age of 18 and never signed a HIPAA authorization giving his own parents and it's their policy that they pay for. And they're just aghast
Yeah.
that we can't act on behalf of our child. Well, that's probably because he's not a child. He's an adult. He may be dumb because 18-year-olds are stupid, right? But but legally they're an
Adult.
adult. And so yeah, even some of those basic things, a durable power of attorney for business decisions, medical power of attorney for medical decisions, HIPAA authorization so you can get copies of medical records, some of those very fundamental things everybody walking around over the age of 18 should have in place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I think the fact that you have the attorney side and the accounting side, I mean, first of all, you must be just like learning 24/7 to try to keep up with all the rules and changes and stuff like that.
That's
So
about right. I'm kind of a super nerd on that.
you'd have to be, my goodness. But I think, you can really bring everything together and create a comprehensive plan for people that I
Yeah.
think somebody couldn't if they were just in one camp or the other.
No, I think that's right. And this is something that I do see with, for example, if I'm, dealing with other attorneys or maybe dealing with accountants, I will hear accountants give advice that makes very good sense from a tax perspective, but then has a legal ramification that they're unaware of. And I've seen plenty over the years of attorneys give legal advice, not recognizing the tax consequence that's associated with their advice. And if you're not paying attention to both of those at the same time, it really can be quite costly. And nobody wants to, I've never met anybody that's come in and said, "Hey, John, is there a way me and my family could pay more to the U.S. Treasury than what we have to?" Um,
We're just feeling very generous.
yeah, we're just feeling super generous, and we think that the U.S. Treasury is a great place
You're
to
doing such a
deposit
good job.
a few extra bucks. We're not spending it. I'd rather them have it. No, that's
Right.
never happened. It's never
I
going to
don't really
happen.
like my family very much. So let's
Right.
give it to the government or to the treasury.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I've had plenty of people with charitable intentions, but I've never had anybody say, yeah, just go ahead and give it to the IRS. They'll
Right.
take care of it.
So actually, I'm glad you brought up charity, because how can people plan for perpetual giving? This is something that I personally want to do, is set up something so that long after I'm gone, there'll be some type of a foundation or something that donates money perpetually. And I understand it's kind of doable without being a multi-billionaire.
It is actually, and that's one of the interesting things. So just real quick, but my background in tax and everything, a lot of that was related to very, very wealthy people and the kind of planning that very, very wealthy people did. but what I found out was that it it's not that those tools are unavailable to anybody else. It's just that they're being utilized by the very, very wealthy. Um, and so, yeah, there's lots of different ways to create some sort of ongoing legacy, particularly a charitable legacy. Now, it could be there can even be some kind of almost no cost ways. So, for example, a lot of states or local communities will have a community foundation. There's the Arkansas Community Foundation, there's the
Yeah.
Texas Community Foundation, many cities, right? You're in Boston, there's probably a Boston
Oh,
Community
yeah.
Foundation or
Yeah.
something like that, right? And you could tie that in to your estate planning. They hold your funds, they segregate your funds. And if you say, I want my funds to be used for, say, animal charities or spaying and neutering of animals specifically, right? You
Yeah.
could even get, well, then they take your money, they pool it in with all the other people's money that have contributed to the community foundation. And then each year they make grants, and your grant comes out as, it's coming from the Boston Community Foundation, but it's got your name attached to it, and so everybody knows that it's coming from you, and that really didn't cost you anything,
Yeah.
right? That they're managing it, they're incurring the fees,
Right.
that sort of thing. But the other thing would be like, you hear when you talk about like these very wealthy people, right? You hear about, say, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Donald Trump Foundation, the Bill and Hillary Clinton Foundation, right? It spans the political spectrum, other than the fact that these people are all very, very rich,
Right.
right? And you can talk about whether or not those folks have true charitable intentions or if this is just a tax dodge, but creating a private foundation is not that expensive and it's not that hard. There's a filing fee with the IRS once you have your underlying documents in place to get your nonprofit status. But I have a client, and she has died, but she wanted all of her money to be used for animal charities in perpetuity. I set up her estate plan so that at her death, a private foundation would be created. And so when she died, we finalized the private foundation. We got the nonprofit designation for it. We pooled all of her money into it. There's a board of directors. They make grants every year. And like if you're here in Texarkana, Arkansas specifically, you could go to the Neva McCormick Animal Shelter, right? It's named after her now because that's where the money is. And I've had a lot of clients that have done similar things where maybe that's a way for their family, right? Their kids are the board of directors, so to speak,
Yeah.
or foundation managers, and their kids annually can kind of make these legacy gifts to whatever charity or charities that mom or dad were passionate about, or whatever the deal is. And that's a beautiful thing. I think people probably should do more charitable planning in their estate planning than what they do. um,
It's interesting, right? The rich feel like they have plenty to share, but maybe some poorer people or some more middle class people don't feel that abundance kind of feeling. So they just like, oh, I barely have enough to do whatever. But I don't know. It's just the more you give, the more you get, right?
yeah, I think that's right. And so many of them, they want to preserve for their children, for example, um, whether or not they need it, or frankly, for that matter, deserve it.
Right.
Um,
Well, and there's all kinds of statistics, right? That like if kids who inherit money or who've always been rich, they don't have the drive, they don't have the ambition, right? They're like living this subpar life. Just
the,
leave your kids a buck and lots of advice.
yeah, the one study that I've often talked about, and I don't have a citation for it or anything, but they looked at a group of people who had received an inheritance, and they didn't pay attention to the amount of the inheritance, right? So some were small, some were very large. They just looked at this group as a whole, and they compared their net worth from the day they received the the day before they received the inheritance to, I think it's 12 or 18 months after. 1/3 of the beneficiaries had a higher net worth a year later. Okay, so those folks had something to show for it. 1/3 had nothing to show for it. So their net worth 12 or 18 months later was dead even with their net worth prior to, so that basically they had spent everything they had received and had nothing to show for it.
Yeah.
But the surprising one was the last third. The last third was poorer 1 year later. And we all know this person, right?
Right.
You give them $1 and somehow they spend $1.50.
Exactly.
But you buy a car that you can't afford. You buy a house, you can't afford the property taxes. And you do these things, and so now you have these assets that you can't maintain. You have to sell them for a loss, or whatever the deal is. You buy a Ferrari, but you can't afford the insurance on a Ferrari, and then you crash the Ferrari, and now you don't have a Ferrari.
You still got the payment.
But you still got the payment, right? You still got the debt on it, and so yeah, I think when you look at that, you're like, okay, well, yeah, I bet a charity might have done a little something better with it than what 2/3 of the beneficiaries are probably going to do, which is
Exactly.
nothing at all.
Right. Right.
And I mean, you talk about legacy, and that is one thing that a lot of people, they may not necessarily express it, but they do want to leave a legacy of some sort. And then somehow they tie in their mind that their money or their property is their legacy, and it's just not. It is absolutely. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've had thousands and thousands and thousands of clients that have died over the years, and I've dealt with their families. There's nothing about the inherited assets that are legacy worthy, and even if it's some fine piece of jewelry or your personal property, right? I can assure you they don't care about any of that stuff. I used to do a radio show, and on the radio show, one of my topics one time was, the top 10 things that you think are important that nobody wants. So your big brown furniture, your grandma's dishes, your book collection,
Those are going right away.
Your
Before you're
Hummel,
cold in the ground, those
that's
suckers are
right.
going.
Yeah, your Hummel figurines, and I'm sorry, yeah, they may mean a lot to you, and that's great if it gives you quality of life, but nobody else wants this stuff. And this is easy to think about, right? Think about a family member, a parent or grandparent, or maybe a beloved aunt or uncle or something, right? But think about a family member who's gone. They're not with us anymore. And then think about, what do you recall, right? When you think of that name, what comes to mind? Or even ask yourself, what did that person buy you for Christmas in 1989?
Right. Who knows?
Nobody has an answer to that.
No one has a clue.
Nobody has an answer to that. But, did you think about a fishing trip? Did you think about some sage advice? Did you, just maybe the care that person showed for their loved ones, or I mean, what brought to mind? That's the legacy. Now look at yourself, right? What are you going to leave behind? And it's not the stuff. It's not the property. It's not the house. It's not the car. It's not any of that stuff. It's going to be those other memories. And so, hey, spend the money to make the memories.
Right. While you're still around and can enjoy it as well.
Absolutely. I've talked to lots of clients over the years, and one of the things that often surprises them when I tell them that I don't buy my kids birthday presents and never have. I buy my kids experiences. So I looked at what the average birthday, where you took presents and a party and all of that, how much is that going to cost, right? Now, how much is a road trip to, I don't know, from where I'm at, you could get to, St. Louis, for example, in 4 or 5 hours.
Yep.
Well, and if I'm in St. Louis, I can go to the Arch and we can do that deal. And maybe we can catch a baseball game. And then we could go out to Anheuser-Busch and see the Clydesdales. And how much did that really cost me? Was it more or less? It's probably about the same as what I would have spent on presents and a birthday party. But grab my oldest daughter and ask her what she got for her 14th birthday. She's 25 and has a kid. Ask her what she got a decade ago for her birthday. And she'll tell you about the trip to St. Louis. Right? And that's, I mean, to me, that's, yeah. So I think you're right. We kind of got all down a rabbit hole there, but I get a little passionate about that because I do think that's important. And I think that's a common mistake for people. Now, that being said, you can't talk these old folks out of it. They're bound and determined to leave a couple of bucks for little Timmy, even though little Timmy's an absolute train wreck and he's going to spend it on, cigarettes and Budweiser within the first 3 days, but whatever.
Awesome. So let's let you talk a little bit about your sort of more, I mean, this is actually perfect and fantastic advice, and I'm so glad we went here. But when somebody first sits down with you, what kind of things, like what's it like? What do you need from them? How does it go? What should people expect? Like the first thing
and whether that's with me or whether that's with any estate planning attorney, they should, at least in my opinion, they should get about the same experience. So for example, I have a lot of clients that they'll walk in, we'll sit down and I'll say, hey, how's it going? What can I do for you? And they say, I want a will. Okay. If my response, and this is, if my response was, okay, what do you want the will to say? I have totally failed that client.
Yes.
Because I'm not giving them any advice. I'm just, at that point, I'm just a lemming, right?
You're legal Zoom, basically.
I'm legal Zoom, right? So when the client comes in, they say, well, I need a will. I said, well, you sure? Let's find out. Because what I want to do is I want to look at your situation in 3 phases. Because there are 3 phases in every good estate plan. Phase 1 is a plan for incapacity. Phase 2 is the transition at death, which needs to be as smooth, easy, and cost-effective as possible. And phase 3 is planning for the beneficiaries and mostly what we hope doesn't happen. Any known issues that we need to address, and then the stuff that we hope doesn't happen. And so then I learn about their age, their income, their assets, whether that's pre-tax assets like IRAs, is it after-tax assets? What are their real estate holdings? Do they still have mortgages? Is everything paid off? And in my mind, I'm when I'm asking a lot of these questions, first thing I'm looking at is, okay, if you become incapacitated, how are you going to pay for yourself? Because if you need something like nursing home care, it's $6,000 a month to $12,000 a month, depending on where you live. And you're either going to have long-term care insurance, which nobody has. You're going to pay cash, which nobody can afford, or you're going to qualify for government benefits, which you can't do unless you're broke. And so I'm looking at, okay, well, maybe here's a wealthy person, or they've got very high income and they would be able to afford their care. Great, I can check that box. Maybe they have long-term care insurance. They're one of the 4% of the population, I think, okay, great, I can check that box, but they're not. Maybe they're not either of those. And so I'm saying, okay, you don't have the ability to private pay, you don't have long-term care insurance, which means the only other payer for that is going to be something like Medicaid. That's a need-based program. Are there things we need to do now to shield your assets so that you could qualify for those government programs without having to go broke first? And let's talk about some different strategies there and maybe put some plans in place. And so, okay, now we've addressed how you're gonna deal with your incapacity. So then now we can start moving up to the transition at death and learning about how assets pass, because they either pass automatically, right? Like if I name you as a beneficiary on my
Yep.
life insurance, I
Automatic.
die, you get it, you show up with a death certificate, get a check, off you go.
Yeah.
If on the other hand, I do a will and I leave you my house, well, you're not going to get that house until you probate the will. That's going to involve attorney's fees and court costs. And if you're in a bigger city, significant delay because the court systems are so backed up. And so we're going to talk about the pros and cons of the different ways and typically some probate alternative strategies. How are we going to pass those assets so that we're staying out of the court system? Maybe that involves a trust. Maybe it's just something as simple as making sure beneficiaries are listed on everything.
Right. Yeah.
And again, depending on, since I already know what all their assets are and stuff, I can kind of gauge myself on, can we keep this simple or do we need something a little more complex here?
Yeah.
And so we're addressing that transition at death, and there's a tax component there too, because we have at least the potential for a death tax if somebody has a relatively high net worth. But even if you're not a high net worth, you've got things like IRA, maybe that's pre-tax money. Somebody gonna pay the tax on that,
Right.
The man's gonna get his, and so we're looking at those sort of things. So okay, what are the tax issues, and then we're going to finally we've got our smooth and easy transition at death, and now we're going to go to the kids. And they've got Tim and Sally, and they're going to leave. Just we're keeping it simple, right? We're leaving everything to Tim and Sally. Okay, well that's fine. But what if Tim dies? Okay, what do we want to happen to his share? So, well, it's going to go to his two kids. Okay, well, how old are they? Well, they're 16 and 18. Well, the 16-year-old's a minor and the 18-year-old's stupid. So we need to be able to, right.
Well,
so
and as people get married, right? Your kids are now married, and now is it going to be jointly? How are you going to, I mean, there's just so many things, right? What if your spouse dies before you do? There's just so many things to think about. I mean, it blows my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. And so we're saying, okay, well, Tim, little Tim, he could die, he could get divorced, he could file bankruptcy, he could be in a lawsuit. Heck, we think about nursing home and stuff like that as being the older generation's problem, but go into any nursing home, lots of old people, couple of young ones, right? And so, what happens if one of the kids has become disabled? We don't want the blessing of an inheritance to turn around and disqualify them from their very needed government benefit programs that are paying for their health insurance.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to make sure that we've got a plan to cover all of those contingencies as well. And at that point, now we've addressed the incapacity, we've addressed the transition at death, and we've addressed the contingencies for bad things that could happen to the kids. And at that point, we have a solid, fully comprehensive estate plan. And on the outset, and it should sound like that's very, very complicated.
It does.
and it should, but imagine, well, just as we sit here today, in 2 weeks, I'm about to have shoulder surgery. I managed to tear the tendons on my left shoulder 4 years after tearing all the tendons on my right shoulder.
Wow.
And so, yes, I am currently burdened with the knowledge of how bad the surgery was the first time.
That's the worst, right? Ignorance is really bliss in those cases.
It really is, yeah. And so I'm going to much trepidation. But in any case, the surgeon, he's actually a client of mine as well. And the first time I went to him when I did my other shoulder, and I'm sitting in his exam room, and because he's a professional and I'm a professional, he starts talking to me like I'm a physician. No. And he's telling me that I've got a tear in my distal thing, and then and he's going to use the XBZ system to. I have no idea. He's speaking total Greek or something, right? He might as well be, because I don't understand a word that's coming out of his mouth. And finally, I stopped him and I was like, Trey, dude, can you just draw a picture or something? And sure enough, he made me hop off the exam table because it's got the white paper over it. And he pulled a marker and he says, he draws a circle. And he's like, okay, this is your shoulder. And here's your little tendons down here at the bottom. And I'm going to pull them up and I'm going to sew them on here. And I'm going to make a little X like you'd see on a backpack where the straps connect. There's like a square and then there's an X. He said, I'm going to make a little stitch and I'm going to make a square and I'm going to make a little X in the center. And that's how I'm going to sew the tendon back onto the bone. I was like, okay, great. I understand that, right? But I guess where my analogy here is the reality of what he's doing from his perspective. There's a lot of complications in there. I, as the patient, or I, as the client of the estate planning attorney, I don't actually need to know in depth the mechanisms of all the complications. What I need to know is, are you going to solve my problem?
And how much is it going to cost me?
And how much is it going to cost? Yeah, well, that's right. And are there alternatives? Yep. Right? What's the consequence of not doing this? Yep. And just like a good doctor will say, yeah, okay, look, here's your problem, and here's the solution, and here's the consequences of not doing it. And maybe, or here's a less invasive option, but here's the drawbacks to that, right? Yep. And so the same thing from the estate planning side, I can say, look, I understand, I've talked a lot about a lot of things, but here's my recommendation. And what my recommendation is going to do is going to protect your assets while you're alive. We're going to pass them at death without a whole lot of baloney. And when you're gone, your kids are going to receive the assets. But if their life goes bad, we've got some stuff already built in here to make sure that they're okay and it's all protected. And now let me use whatever technologies I have, like that surgeon, to put this into place and accomplish your goal. I actually I had a client, and I guess you call it client or potential client, but he and I parted ways this week because I drafted some stuff for him and I gave it to him, and he came back and he said, John, this is too complicated. I don't understand it. And I said, well, your goal was to do X, Y, and Z. Yes. I said, okay, well, what I have done is I have addressed X, Y, and Z. He said, yeah, but I can't read these words. I don't know what these words mean. This is too complicated. I want you to simplify it. And I said, well, I can't simplify it because that runs the risk of not accomplishing your goal. I said, look, if I was a doctor and you said, hey, I've got an appendicitis, well, the simple way for me to fix that would be to pull out my pocket knife and just cut it out of you right now. But you don't want a simple methodology. You want a simple recovery. Let me do it as complicated as I need to so that the result is good. Yeah. But he and I, we were just at an impasse. And so we ended up parting ways as friends, and that's all good. Yeah. But that is a common mistake with folks, is they're like, oh, I want to keep it simple. Well, no. You want the outcome simple. Let the estate plan be as complicated as it needs to be so that the outcome is simple.
Yeah. And that's where trust, right? They have to trust you.
And that is where, and on that note, law is a very, very complicated area. There are lots of different types of law, and we're at a point now, just like medical, you have specialties, right? I mean, this shoulder issue, I've probably seen 4 doctors already, and I'll see 7 by the time I'm done, right? Because I had my family practice guy, and he had to send me over to a radiologist, and the radiologist took some pictures, and then he sent them over to the orthopedic surgeon, right? So I'm already at 3 doctors here. When I show up at the hospital in 2 weeks, I'm going to have an anesthesiologist who's going to make me go to bed and go nighty-night. Yep. And so, we all understand that in the medical field. Common knowledge, everybody gets that. And yet somebody says, oh, you know what? I need to get some estate planning done. Who was that lawyer that did my divorce in 1975?
I know. So I'm a real estate agent, right? So people will be like, oh, I know an attorney. I'm like, is it a real estate attorney? Or, you know what I mean? Or are they a probate lawyer? Like, let me
Right.
just make sure that we've got the right field here.
Yeah. And so I'll often tell people, I say, well, look at the, go to their website, and look, what are they advertising? You know, does their website say that they do 18-wheeler wrecks and divorce and bankruptcy and also they can do a will for you?
Yeah.
That's not the guy.
Right.
And
Absolutely not.
again, once you explain that to people, they're like, oh, well, okay, yeah, that kind of makes sense. If you're talking about planning, living in retirement, planning for that period of your life and the transition at death, then you find somebody that's what they do, and that's
Right.
all that they do.
Because there's so
Um,
much to it.
right. Because if I was trying to do what I do and also get your kid out of a DWI, I would do neither of them well.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely not.
that's just the reality of it.
Yeah.
If you wouldn't go to your dentist for heart surgery, and you don't go to a divorce attorney for estate planning.
Absolutely not.
That's just the way it is.
So John, I think you're the guy. I think you're awesome. I'm actually I have my friend in Dallas. I'm actually gonna send her to you if she's open to it. Because
Yes.
yeah, you're awesome. Is there anything that you would? I mean, our time is just like flown by. But is there anything you wish I would have asked you that I didn't ask you? Anything you want to make sure people know, and make sure they know how to reach you, of course, as well.
Well, I guess I'll end it with this. I mentioned earlier my speech on my 5 big mistakes, and my last one, my final mistake. And this is the most common mistake that everybody makes, and that is the mistake of just doing absolutely nothing. We've all done it, me included. I don't know how many years I did this for other people before I did my own planning. Right. So
Bad luck.
that's right. So I'm guilty of it. We're all guilty of it. This is not a new phenomenon. It's been happening. You can even go. If you really want to, you can go all the way back to the Old Testament. There's the story of Jacob and Esau, and their dad Isaac. He's going to leave his estate to the oldest boy, Esau. Right? That's the plan. Everybody knows the plan. But does Isaac do anything? No. He waits until he's blind and he's bedridden. And we actually have a phrase for that stage of life in our practice. We call it frail, vulnerable, but not incompetent.
Yeah, true.
Right? You're frail, you're vulnerable. You're still competent, but you're so frail and vulnerable. But so like Isaac, he's going to leave everything to his oldest boy, Esau. But in the meantime, Jacob, his other boy, goes in there dressed up like Esau, is actually wrapped up in goat fur because Esau's a big hairy kid, right? And so he wraps himself up in goat fur and he goes in, and poor Isaac, all he can do is reach out and touch the goat fur, and he ends up bestowing his blessing, which was the ancient Jewish tradition essentially of estate planning, right? They didn't have a 401k in
Right.
ancient times, right? So he bestows his blessing on the child that he did not intend. And so his whole plan gets twisted there at the end. Why? Because he waited too long. And so, my final piece of advice is do something. Get out there, do something.
Yeah.
Anything's probably better than nothing.
Yeah. Yeah. Excellent. Excellent. So how can people reach you? Well, we're going to put all your links in the show notes, but people for sure, listeners for sure, check out Big Picture Podcast. It's excellent. They have a lot of great topics, things that you need to know and learn. And what else? How else do you want people to connect with you?
Well, and if people ever have any questions, I've got clients from all over the United States. So you can check out my law firm's website at rossandschulmeyer.com. We got a bunch of good articles and stuff on there. And sometimes people just email me out of the blue and say, hey, I got a quick little weird situation. Any bright ideas? So yeah, feel free, reach out to me anytime.
Excellent. John, thanks so much for being with us. You're a wealth of knowledge. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks.
All right, cool. And thank you, listener, for listening. And people don't have to be old and infirm for you to forward this podcast to them. Share it with anybody you know who probably doesn't have a plan, which is probably 80% of the people you know, and get them at least thinking about what could possibly happen. and have a wonderful week. I'll see you next week. Thanks.